"Stop that truck. You're towing my vehicle off private property." The driver had already pulled my pickup halfway down the driveway when I arrived. Behind him, 2 SUVs full of strangers sat idling, waiting to take its place. He didn't answer me. He pointed toward Diane Mercer, the HOA president. She stood beside a new sign planted at the edge of my lawn. Community Event Parking, Section C. "Your truck was blocking an authorized event zone," she said. Then she gave me that patient little smile she used whenever she thought someone was too stupid to understand her rules. "Diane, this is my driveway. It's part of my lot." She looked directly at me. "Not when the association needs it." Then she waved the tow truck forward. What Diane didn't know was that she had just signed an order claiming control over property the HOA had never owned. And when I pulled the recorded county documents to prove it, I found something far more serious than a bad parking map. My driveway had been added to an event plan connected to a contract Diane had never fully explained to the board. That was why she needed my land. That was why she had my truck removed. And that was why she couldn't afford to admit she was wrong. By the time it was over, my truck was back where it belonged. Every towing charge had been reimbursed. The driveway was still mine. Diane's presidency wasn't. 2 weeks earlier, my driveway was the least controversial piece of concrete in Magnolia Ridge Estates. Claire and I had bought the house 3 years before. It sat on Lot 47, near the end of a quiet street in Winter Garden, Florida. Close enough to the community clubhouse that we could hear the music from summer gatherings, but far enough away that it had never caused us any trouble. The driveway was one of the reasons we chose the house. It was wider than most in the neighborhood, with enough room for my pickup and Claire's SUV without either of us blocking the garage. I used the truck for my job as an electrical maintenance technician. Claire used her SUV to take our 9-year-old daughter, Lily, to school. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked for our family. The HOA occasionally held events at the clubhouse, holiday dinners, weekend markets, fundraisers. When the small clubhouse lot filled up, visitors parked along designated sections of the private community road. Once or twice, someone stopped too close to our driveway, but they always moved when we asked. There had never been a sign. There had never been a dispute. And no one had ever suggested that any part of Lot 47 belonged to the community. That changed on a Thursday afternoon. I came home from work and found 3 small orange stakes driven into the grass beside my driveway. A temporary sign stood between them. Event Parking, Section C. An arrow pointed directly toward the concrete in front of my garage. At first, I assumed a contractor had put it in the wrong place. I took several photographs, pulled the sign out of the grass, and moved it beside the clubhouse walkway. Then I emailed the HOA management address and explained exactly what I had found. I told them the Section C parking sign had been placed on Lot 47, that I had moved it to the clubhouse entrance, and that any future event signs needed to remain off my property. I expected a routine reply, something like, "Sorry about the confusion." Instead, less than an hour later, someone rang my doorbell. Diane Mercer stood on the porch, holding the same sign in one hand and a laminated neighborhood map in the other. Diane had been HOA president for nearly 6 years. She dressed every conversation like a board meeting, pressed blouse, leather folder, reading glasses hanging from a silver chain. Even when she appeared at someone's home without warning, she behaved as though they had been summoned to hers. "You removed association property," she said. I moved a sign that was placed on my lot. Diane unfolded the laminated map. Several areas surrounding the clubhouse had been shaded blue. The same color stretched across the lower half of my driveway. "This is the approved event parking plan," she said. "Your driveway is part of Section C." I looked from the map to the garage behind me. That doesn't make any sense. "The community has access rights." "What kind of access rights?" "An easement." That word made me pause. I remembered a utility and drainage easement in our closing documents. As I understood it, that allowed utility crews to access a limited part of the property when they needed to maintain lines or drainage. It didn't turn my driveway into a public parking lot. At least, nothing I had signed said that it did. Can you show me where it says the HOA can use my driveway for parking? Diane folded the map before I could examine it more closely. This neighborhood existed before you bought that house, Mr. Reed. So did the property lines. Her expression tightened. Then she pushed the orange stakes back into my lawn and replaced the sign exactly where I had found it. The event begins Saturday at 10, she said. Please make sure both vehicles are moved before 9. She turned and walked toward the clubhouse. I photographed the sign again, this time with the front of my house visible behind it. At that moment, I still believed this was a misunderstanding that could be resolved with one deed, one map, and one reasonable conversation. I was wrong about the conversation, and Diane was wrong about the map. Saturday morning, I left my pickup in the driveway. Claire's SUV was beside it. I figured nobody would mistake an occupied residential driveway for available event parking. By 9:30, someone had proved me wrong. A man wearing a yellow event vest appeared outside with a clipboard. He pointed 2 approaching vehicles toward our house, then stopped when he noticed our cars. He studied the clipboard. Then he knocked. "Morning. We need you to clear Section C." "There is no Section C here," I told him. "This is my driveway." He looked past me toward the garage. "The HOA gave us a parking plan. Your address is on it. Did anyone ask for my permission?" He hesitated. "I just worked the event, sir." That was the first moment I understood Diane hadn't merely threatened to use my property. She had already told other people they could. I asked to see his clipboard. The map looked more polished than the laminated copy Diane had shown me. It included parking sections, directional arrows, and the Magnolia Ridge HOA logo. My driveway appeared in blue. 3 words were printed over it. Overflow access. C. There was no deed attached, no written permission, no recorded parking agreement. Just a colored shape on a document designed to look official. I photographed the page before the attendant pulled it away. "Diane said there was an easement," I told him. "Does that paperwork explain what kind?" He scanned the page. "No, sir." "Then nobody parks here." He stepped aside and spoke into his radio. Within minutes, Diane arrived. "You're creating unnecessary disruption," she said. "I'm asking you not to send strangers onto my driveway. It's a community event. Then use community property." She glanced at the garage behind me. "You can park inside your garage so our guests have room." She said it like she was doing me a favor. Like allowing me to keep my own vehicle somewhere on my own property was an act of generosity. "My garage isn't the issue," I said. "Then stop making this difficult." For the next hour, attendants redirected vehicles toward the clubhouse. But shortly after noon, Claire returned from taking Lily to a friend's birthday party. A dark SUV had stopped across the entrance to our driveway. Another vehicle waited behind it. Claire couldn't turn in. I walked outside and asked the first driver to move. She lowered her window. "The lady in charge told us to wait here." "This is the entrance to my house." The driver looked embarrassed and pulled forward. After Claire finally parked, Lily climbed out and looked toward the line of unfamiliar cars. "Dad, why do those people think they can use our house?" I didn't have a good answer. Across the street, Teresa Alvarez was watching from her front yard. She had lived in Magnolia Ridge since the first homes were built and usually avoided neighborhood arguments. That afternoon, she crossed the street. "They never used your driveway like this before," she said quietly. "Diane claims they have an easement." Teresa glanced toward the clubhouse. "I've seen that map. It isn't one of the original property maps. What is it then?" "Something they started using after Diane brought in an outside event company." "Which company?" "I don't know the name, but the events got bigger. and suddenly they needed parking spaces the clubhouse didn't have. That evening, I compared the photograph of the attendance map with the documents from our home purchase. One mentioned a utility and drainage easement. Nothing mentioned event parking. Nothing mentioned guest vehicles. And nothing gave Diane Mercer permission to redraw my property lines with a blue marker. The following morning, an email arrived from the HOA. It said my refusal to cooperate with approved community parking operations had been documented. Continued interference could result in daily fines. Vehicles obstructing designated event areas, it warned, were subject to towing at the vehicle owner's expense. It was a threat, not proof that any fine had been properly approved. But the message made one thing perfectly clear. Diane had already decided what she planned to do with my truck. Claire read the email twice. They're threatening to charge us for taking our own car? I looked at the photograph of Diane's parking map, at the blue section covering my driveway, and at the words, "Overflow access" printed across land I paid taxes on. They're threatening us, I said, because they need everyone to believe that map is real. Monday morning, I replied to the HOA's email. I asked for the recorded document giving the association parking rights over Lot 47, any written approval from the board, and the specific rule Diane believed I had violated. I kept the message polite. I also copied the community management office and requested a written response. By Tuesday afternoon, Diane sent one. The association's long-standing access rights and approved operational plans established sufficient authority for community event parking. That was it. No deed, no recorded agreement, no explanation of how a utility easement supposedly became a parking lot. Just a sentence designed to sound official enough that I might stop asking questions. I didn't. On Wednesday, another event notice appeared near the clubhouse. Magnolia Ridge Spring Market. Saturday, 10 in the morning. Additional guest parking available in designated overflow areas. Section C was back on the map. Friday evening, I parked my pickup in the middle of our driveway and left Claire's SUV inside the garage. My truck wasn't blocking the street. It wasn't blocking a fire hydrant. It wasn't blocking anyone's entrance except the imaginary parking lot Diane had drawn over my property. Saturday morning, Claire needed a few things from the hardware store. I considered staying home. But the pickup was locked, the driveway was private, and I had already notified the HOA that nobody had permission to use it. So we took Claire's SUV. We were gone less than 40 minutes. When we turned onto our street, I saw flashing amber lights outside our house. My pickup was hanging behind a tow truck. Two unfamiliar SUVs waited near the driveway, and Diane Mercer stood beside a freshly planted sign. Community Event Parking. Section C. I got out before Claire had fully parked. "Stop that truck. You're towing my vehicle off private property." The driver pointed toward Diane. "Your truck was blocking an authorized event zone," she said. "Diane, this is my driveway. It's part of my lot." She looked directly at me. "Not when the association needs it." Then she waved the driver forward. I pulled out my phone and recorded the truck, its company name, the license plate, and Diane standing beside the parking sign. I told the driver I disputed the tow and asked where he was taking my vehicle. He gave me the storage address. He did not unload the truck. A few seconds later, my pickup disappeared around the corner. The first SUV moved into my driveway before the tow truck had even reached the main road. Claire stared at the empty space beside our garage. She actually did it. I contacted local law enforcement and explained that my vehicle had been removed from my residential driveway at the HOA's direction. The responding officer documented my complaint, checked the towing information, and confirmed where the truck had been taken. He explained that the dispute over who controlled the property would need to be supported by the relevant records. He didn't arrest Diane. He didn't settle the ownership question. But now, there was a documented complaint. At the storage yard, the employee told me the release fee was $380. $380, I repeated, to get back a truck that was parked at my own house. He slid a payment form across the counter. We received authorization from your HOA. Did anyone verify that the HOA controlled the property where my truck was parked? He glanced at the computer. The request came from the association president. That wasn't my question. The employee shrugged. You'll have to take that up with them. I paid the $380 because I needed my truck for work. Then I requested an itemized receipt and a copy of the towing authorization. The employee printed both. Under the section identifying who had requested the removal, one line appeared. Magnolia Ridge. HOA, D. Mercer. No signature from me, no permission from Claire. Just Diane claiming the association had authority over land she had never proved it controlled. I folded the paperwork and put it in my pocket. Diane hadn't simply told an attendant that my driveway belonged to the community. She had signed an order, treating it that way. And if the recorded documents showed the HOA had no parking rights over Lot 47, that signature was going to be much harder to explain than a blue mark on a map. When I brought the truck home, the event had ended. The strangers were gone. But the parking sign was still standing beside my driveway. I photographed it one more time. Then I opened our closing documents and called a real estate attorney. Diane wanted to make this about who controlled Lot 47. I was ready to find out exactly what the county records said. Monday morning, I met with a real estate attorney named Rachel Bennett. I brought our closing documents, the towing receipt, Diane's authorization, photographs of the parking signs, and a screenshot of the HOA's enforcement email. Rachel spread everything across her desk. She examined the event map first. This is the document they're relying on, as far as I can tell. And when you asked for recorded parking rights, they told me their operational plans established authority. Rachel set the map aside. An operational plan can organize parking. It cannot create a property right. Then she pulled up the Orange County Property Appraiser's website. A parcel map showed Lot 47 beside the clubhouse. My driveway appeared inside the lot boundaries. I leaned forward. So that settles it. No, Rachel said. Property appraiser maps are useful for locating parcels. They're not a boundary survey, and they don't replace recorded property documents. She opened the county's official records instead. First came the deed. It identified Claire and me as the owners of Lot 47 in Magnolia Ridge Estates. Next came the recorded subdivision plat. The lot lines placed our driveway within the boundaries of Lot 47, beside a narrow marked easement. Rachel compared the plat with the survey from our closing file. Then she found the language describing the easement. Utility access, drainage, maintenance related to those purposes. She read it twice before turning the screen toward me. There's nothing here authorizing event parking. What about guest access? Not here. Overflow parking? No. HOA control whenever Diane decides the community needs it? Rachel looked at me over her glasses. Especially not that. For the first time since the tow truck pulled away, I felt something stronger than anger. Certainty. Not because a website showed a line. Not because I remembered what someone told us at closing. Because the recorded documents explained what Lot 47 was, who owned it, and what the easement actually allowed. Diane's blue parking section did none of those things. Rachel examined the towing authorization next. The important question is whether the person requesting the tow had authority over the property where your truck was parked. She signed as HOA president. Being president doesn't automatically give her authority over your driveway. And the towing company? You challenged the tow while the driver was still removing your vehicle. That matters. We'll request the company's dispatch records, authorization documents, and written procedures before reaching any conclusions. She drafted a letter addressed to the association, the management company, and the towing operator. It stated that Lot 47 was privately owned, that the recorded easement did not grant event parking rights, that I disputed the removal of my vehicle and requested reimbursement of the $380 release fee. It also demanded preservation of the towing request, dispatch records, event parking plans, and communications concerning my property. Finally, it requested that the association stop directing vehicles onto our driveway. Rachel attached the deed, the recorded plat, the relevant easement language, and the closing survey. "One more thing," she said. She pointed to the HOA's warning about daily fines. "A threat in an email isn't the same as a valid fine. If they attempt enforcement, Florida law requires the applicable notice and an opportunity for a hearing before an independent committee." Independent from Diane? Independent from the board. She doesn't get to accuse you and then sit on the committee deciding whether to impose the fine. The letter went out that afternoon. By Tuesday morning, the sign beside my driveway had disappeared. I thought that meant Diane had finally understood the situation. Then the management office sent me a new message. The association maintained that its parking plan was supported by long-standing community use. It also stated that my conduct remained under review. Attached was a written notice scheduling a compliance hearing more than 2 weeks later concerning my alleged interference with community operations. Claire read it at the kitchen counter. "They saw the deed and still scheduled a hearing?" "Apparently," Teresa called an hour later. "I heard Diane talking after the board meeting," she said. "What did she say?" "That if your driveway comes off the event plan, the association may have a problem with its vendor." "What kind of problem?" She didn't explain, but another board member asked why nobody had seen the full contract. I looked at the parking map on my screen, the clubhouse lot, the arrows, the blue shading over my driveway. Suddenly, Section C looked less like a careless mistake. It looked like a promise, a parking space somebody had already counted on. "Teresa," I asked, "do you know who that board member was?" "Michael Grant, the treasurer." "Would he talk to me?" There was a pause. "He might," she said, "especially after he finds out whose name is on the vendor paperwork." "Whose name?" "Mercer." I looked toward the driveway outside our window. Diane had insisted the association needed my property. What I hadn't understood was that the person who needed it most might have been Diane herself. More than 2 weeks later, the compliance hearing took place on a Thursday evening. It was held in a smaller room beside the clubhouse, 1 hour before the regular board meeting. Diane sat along the wall with the other board members. She could present the alleged violation. She could not decide its outcome. That authority belonged to a 3-member compliance committee whose members were not directors, employees, or relatives of anyone on the board. Rachel attended with me. She placed a slim folder on the table. No dramatic stack of papers, no angry speech, just the documents Diane had spent weeks avoiding. The committee chair began. "Mr. Reed, the association alleges that you interfered with an approved community parking area and obstructed association operations. How do you respond?" Rachel slid copies across the table. "By asking the association to identify the recorded right that converted his privately owned driveway into event parking." The chair examined the first document. The deed identified Claire and me as the owners of Lot 47. The recorded plat placed the driveway inside its boundaries. The survey confirmed the same layout. And the easement language limited access to utility, drainage, and related maintenance purposes. Rachel pointed to the event map last. "This document may show where the association wanted people to park. It does not establish where the association had a legal right to send them." Diane leaned forward. "That area has been used for community access." "For how long?" one committee member asked. It has been part of our operational plan. That wasn't the question, he said. The room went quiet. Diane tried again. The board approved the plan for the benefit of the community. Rachel opened the towing authorization. Did the board also approve removing Mr. Reed's vehicle from his driveway? Diane looked toward the other directors. Nobody answered for her. The president is authorized to manage event operations, she said. Rachel placed the $380 receipt beside Diane's signature. Then the record should reflect that the president personally authorized a tow from property the HOA has not demonstrated any parking rights over. The committee recessed for 11 minutes. When its members returned, the chair read the decision. The committee does not approve the proposed fine. Diane's expression changed. The patient's smile disappeared first. Then the certainty. The committee did not rule on every possible dispute between us and the association. It didn't award damages or remove Diane from office. It simply refused to approve a punishment that the documents did not support. That should have ended Section C. Instead, it opened the door to everything behind it. An hour later, the regular board meeting began. Nearly 60 residents filled the clubhouse. Teresa sat beside Claire. Rachel and I took seats in the second row. Diane called the meeting to order, as though the hearing had never happened. When she reached the treasurer's report, Michael Grant did not read the usual account balances. He placed a contract on the table. I requested the vendor records for the spring market, he said. The management office provided this yesterday. Diane's hand tightened around her pen. Michael continued. The event services agreement is with Mercer Community Events, LLC. A murmur moved through the room. Diane tapped the microphone. The company name is irrelevant. Michael turned to the final page. The company's manager is Evan Mercer. Someone behind me asked the question everyone was thinking. Is that your son? Diane stared into the crowd. He operates an independent business. That isn't what I asked, Michael said. Yes, he is my son. The room erupted. Diane struck the table with the gavel. There is nothing illegal about hiring a qualified vendor. Michael waited until the room settled. I'm not accusing anyone of a crime. I'm asking why the relationship wasn't clearly disclosed in the materials given to the board. He opened the meeting minutes from 3 months earlier. The entry described the vendor only as an outside event coordinator. No company name. No ownership information. No recorded disclosure that Diane's son managed it. Michael produced a second document. The vendor's site plan promised a specific number of overflow spaces near the clubhouse. Section C was included in that total. My driveway was one of those spaces. That was why Diane couldn't remove it from the map. Without Lot 47, the plan she had presented to the board no longer matched the parking capacity promised in the event contract. The blue shape wasn't a mistake. It was a number she needed. Michael looked directly at Diane. Did you tell the vendor it could use Nathan Reed's driveway before verifying that the association had parking rights over it? The easement provided access. For utilities and drainage, I said. Rachel didn't need to argue. She handed Michael the recorded language. He read it silently, then passed it to the director beside him. Within seconds, copies were moving around the table. Diane looked at me. You could have avoided all of this by cooperating for one weekend. I thought about Lily asking why strangers believed they could use our house. I thought about my truck disappearing behind a tow vehicle, and the $380 I had paid to get it back. You could have avoided all of this, I said, by reading the document before claiming my property. Michael made 3 motions that night. The first directed management to remove Lot 47 from every association parking plan. The second authorized the association's attorney to negotiate reimbursement of the towing charge and resolve my documented legal expenses. The third ordered an independent review of vendor contracts, related party disclosures, and event spending during Diane's time as president. The motions passed, but removing Diane from the board required the homeowners, not just the directors sitting beside her. Teresa stood during the owner comment period. She held up a packet of written recall agreements. "This isn't a vote by shouting," she said. "Anyone who signs should read the documents and follow the required procedure." Over the next several days, residents went door to door. They didn't sign because Michael had proved a kickback. He hadn't. They signed because Diane had concealed a family relationship from the records presented to them, defended an unsupported property claim, and authorized a tow rather than admit her parking plan was wrong. When agreements representing a majority of the community's total voting interests had been collected and verified, the owner's representative formally served them on the association. The board scheduled the required certification meeting. Within 5 full business days, the clubhouse filled again. Diane sat at the center of the table. This time, there was no event map in front of her. The remaining directors reviewed the recall documents and certified the result. Effective immediately, Diane Mercer was removed from the board. Because she was no longer a director, she was no longer HOA president. No handcuffs, no police escort, just a valid vote and a paper trail she couldn't redraw. The remaining directors later filled the vacancy and selected new officers. Michael became interim president. The contract review began the following week. Its purpose was to examine the association's records and approval procedures, not to declare Diane guilty before the evidence had been reviewed. Our dispute was resolved through a written agreement. The HOA reimbursed the full $380. It also covered the documented legal expense we had incurred to establish the property rights Diane should have verified before ordering the tow. In return, every association parking plan was corrected, and the HOA acknowledged in writing that the recorded easement over Lot 47 did not authorize event parking. The next time the neighborhood held an event, I watched the cars pass our house without slowing down. No orange stakes, no parking sign, no strangers waiting for my truck to disappear. Just the driveway Claire and I had bought 3 years earlier. Diane thought her title gave her the right to redraw a property line. But titles change, presidents lose their seats, and parking maps can be thrown away. The recorded line around Lot 47. That never moved. If your HOA tried to claim your driveway and tow your vehicle, would you fight the board or let it go to keep the peace? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe to HOA Next Door, where the truth is always in the records.